At 11:32 a.m., on November 29, 1943, 24,000 feet above the cold gray of northern Germany, everything that made a young man feel secure in the world tore away in a single, impossible instant. The altimeter needle quivered, steel cracked. The sky, which moments before had been a broad, indifferent plain of altitude and distance, became a tunnel of falling metal and the distant thunder of battle. Down below, Bremen waited, in the tail of a crippled B-17. A 19-year-old gunner named Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran had no idea whether he would live to see the ground. This is the story promised by the title. Surviving a B-17 crash, the harrowing account of a tail gunner who plummeted from roughly 4 miles up, trapped in a severed tail section, with shattered limbs and a parachute rendered useless, and yet somehow survived. It is a tale of machines failing and human tenacity holding on, of improvisation in medicine and cruelty in captivity, of a life reshaped by a single afternoon over Bremen. The facts that follow are drawn from military records, crew reports, and interviews with surviving witnesses. Where sources conflict, the script notes that a detail is described as reported or according to records. If this kind of historical rescue matters to you, and you want more carefully researched accounts like this, consider subscribing. Stories like these survive because people remember and pass them on. Eugene Moran was not a soldier by temperament so much as by circumstance. He had been a farm boy from Wisconsin, the kind of young man who knew how to mend equipment with raw hands and who enlisted with the practical confidence of someone used to hard work. He was 17 when he volunteered for the Army Air Forces. Training made him a tail gunner, the loneliest seat on the most dangerous machine in the sky. Tail gunners sat at the very rear of the aircraft, squeezed into a cramped plexiglass enclosure with twin .50 caliber machine guns on either side. From that tiny bubble they watched the sky they had already passed over, the airspace the bomber had already cleared, and waited for the enemy to come up from behind. The 8th Air Force's daylight strategic bombing campaign was born of necessity and stubborn optimism. Flying in daylight promised accuracy, but it also exposed crews to the concentrated fury of German defenses, flak, bursts of anti-aircraft artillery that turned the sky into a field of black petals, and fighter interceptors that rode the gun streams of the flak to rip into weakened bombers. Bomber crews learned that survival was statistical and cruel. Completing the required missions to rotate home was a gauntlet that trimmed wings quickly. The average life of a heavy bomber crew in 1943 was frighteningly short. For a tail gunner, the risks were concentrated. You were far from the cockpit, isolated, with only the armored fuselage between you and the open sky. You were a target. On that late November mission, the 96th Bomb Group flew toward Bremen as part of a larger formation assigned to hit industrial targets. The group took to the air with the usual choreography of heavy bombers. Boxed formations meant to maximize overlapping fire and protect vulnerable positions. Fighter escorts rotating in and out depending on range and fuel. The B-17 carrying Moran, reported in various records under the nickname Ricky Tikatavi, spelling reported as variants in archival sources, maintained formation through the early part of the mission. Weather and the mechanized choreography of hundreds of aircraft painted the morning in layers. The dull flash of cumulus banks, the silver-white reflection of sunlight off wings, radios crackling with clipped commands. Then the sky itself began to bite back. Flak struck first. From the ground, anti-aircraft batteries sent up ribbons of smoke and the thunder of fragmentation shells. Those black puffs blossomed around the lead elements of the formation, like the petals of some vast, lethal flower. A burst in front of a bomber meant nothing to a tail gunner. A burst behind could be the end. Metal shredded fabric and aluminum with equal ease. At high altitude, the chance that a bomber would take a direct hit was lower than in the low altitudes of earlier conflicts. But when a shell found its mark, it could cleave control surfaces, punch through fuel tanks, or cripple engines. The B-17 was known for survivability, but it was not invulnerable. After the flak had done its work, after it had pried open the armor of the formation, the Luftwaffe fighters arrived. German pilots had learned the anatomy of the bomber formations. They learned which parts of the heavy 4-engine fortresses could be coaxed into braking, or which gun positions could be neutralized quickly. Attacks often came in well-timed strikes, an initial diversion to draw fire, a concentrated assault that found a seam. For the crew of Moran's ship, the seam appeared in the form of a coordinated attack that found multiple engines in the tail. Engines lost power. The bomber began to fall out of formation. Once the aircraft lagged, it became a beacon for the fighters. From the tail, Moran had the worst of it, and the clearest view. Accounts describe a cramped vantage point, and the sensory onslaught of aerial combat, the battering rumble of engines, the sharp report of their own guns, the metallic tang in the air where oil and cordite mingled, the sting of cold that seeped into bone through the thin fabric of the flight suits at altitude. Gunnery was physical work. It required bracing against recoil, tracking a small, fast target across a vast sky, and reacting to commands from the waist, the radio room, and the cockpit. The tail gunner's role was both defensive and often last line, to keep enemy fighters from delivering the coup de grace to the fuselage. As documented in post-war debriefs and crew accounts, Moran and the rest of the crew fought back. There are records crediting tail gunners with protective fire that deterred some attacks. There are also records showing how quickly a concentrated assault could overwhelm any one position. In the case of Moran's aircraft, machine guns and cannons carved into the tail. Armor plates were pierced. Structural integrity, the invisible stitching that held the bomber together, began to fail. Witnesses later described a horror of metal and splintered control cables as the structure compromised. Jesse Orison, the navigator, is recorded as a corroborating witness to what came next: structural failure and then separation. What happened, the way the B-17 came apart in the thin cold air at altitude, reads like a mechanical tragedy. A fusion of hits in critical locations, combined with stress from maneuvering and the ship's own controls, allowed the fuselage to fracture. The forward section, cockpit, crew compartments, bomb bay and wings, suddenly pulled away. Those sections, laden with fuel and weight, went into an immediate, steep plunge. Down they went, an exploding geometry of fabric and flame and falling men. The tail, however, remained, severed from the heavier structures, stripped of power, but for a moment still coherent enough to be a place. Moran was in that tail. His parachute, according to records, had been ripped when a shell passed through the area. Other sources say lines were severed or the pack itself was mangled by shrapnel. Either way, by the time the fuselage ahead sheared away, he had no functioning chute. His arms had been struck by rounds and splintered by flying enamel and screws. His hands and forearms were reported fractured. Yet in the immediate violent minutes that followed separation, he continued to man his guns. Reports indicate that even as the tail section tumbled, Moran fired intermittently, perhaps because the simplest human reflex in a man trained to defend his aircraft was to keep doing what he had been doing. The tail behaved in ways that would confound expectations. A single airframe piece is not meant to descend as an isolated aerodynamic unit, but the stabilizers and an intact part of the fuselage produced enough surface area and a fortunate alignment of lift and drag to reduce the terminal speed relative to what a human body alone would have experienced. Documented accounts suggest that the tail created a form of ragged parachute, sometimes gliding, sometimes tumbling, that slowed its fall. Aviation historians and engineers have analyzed similar incidents and caution that these explanations are probabilistic rather than deterministic. In this case, the tail's control surfaces, though damaged, conferred enough of an aerodynamic profile to keep the structure from plummeting at the full speed of free fall. Tumbling is a word that understates the violence of such a descent. It implies rotation, disorientation, the backing and lurching of a structure buffeted by air at thousands of feet per minute. The sensation, if it can be imagined from reports, was of a coffin thrown like a dice through the sky, spinning and shuddering, alternately presenting broad surfaces and thin edges to the rushing atmosphere. Inside, Moran was trapped with broken limbs and a shredded canopy. He could not climb out. He could not jump clear. He had no working parachute. He had training, reflex, and a stubborn resolve that would not permit him to simply stop. According to crew accounts and post-war interviews, he kept firing as the tail rolled and slid through the air. Time in freefall dilates differently in memory and in the flight log. A fall from 24,000 feet is measured in minutes on the clock, but in an eternity of sensations for the person inside it. Wind screams, pressure drops, Temperature plummets. Instruments and instruments' needles are irrelevant. The tail section's descent was marked by odd pauses of aerodynamic balancing and sudden slips threatening to accelerate the tumble. At lower altitude, the tail struck things that interrupted the pattern. It clipped the edge of cloud bank turbulence, hit treetops on the outskirts of a village, and finally struck the frozen earth with enough force to break the fragile body of the fuselage into still smaller pieces. When the tail hit, the world reassembled itself into discrete noises. The sickening crunch of metal on wood, the tearing of fabric, the dull thud against frozen ground. Bystanders on the ground, according to wartime records and local reports collected post-war, saw pieces of the bombers strewn across an icy field. The frozen countryside carried the scattered debris like evidence of a trial. German soldiers soon arrived. War, which until then had been a cacophonous ballet in the skies, turned at once into a grid of tactical procedure. Secure the wreckage, account for the dead, and collect the living. Moran was alive. He was so badly hurt that initial reports from the scene suggest German troops believed him beyond help. He was, according to records, left for a time in the wreckage. Yet the same reports show that someone, whether a passerby, a soldier assigned to the crash site, or a medical team moving through the lines, believed he should be taken to a military facility. There is no confirmed dialogue recorded at the scene. The script of those first minutes on the ground is made of logistics and determination rather than words. He was loaded onto a cart and moved. His injuries were severe but not the final sentence. Observers later described a survivor who was delirious, fevered, and near death. The head injuries alone were grave, bones fractured, and it was later reported, a portion of the skull compromised. Yet German medical facilities at the front, though functional, were stretched. According to documented accounts, 2 Serbian surgeons serving under German command performed emergency surgery using what instruments and antiseptics they could gather. They reportedly cleaned infection, set fractured bones, and, most astonishingly, used a metal plate to cover the area where bone had been lost. Details of the operation must be described with caution. Wartime medicine in field conditions is not a field for florid description. Records show that those surgeons worked under austere conditions, with a limited supply of anesthesia and antibiotics that were rudimentary by modern standards. Their work, however, became a turning point in Moran's story. It is important in this account to make clear what is documented and what remains partly inferred. The basic sequence: tail severed, Moran trapped in the tail, fall from approximately 24,000 feet, survival of the impact, capture, and emergency surgery by field physicians, is supported by military and hospital records and corroborated by surviving crew reports, including testimony from navigator Jesse Orison. Precise details of the sensations inside the tail while tumbling, or the private thoughts Moran may have had in the moment, cannot be reconstructed without inventing inner monologue. Where personal reactions are necessary, they are attributed to Moran's later recollections. The core miracle of the narrative is not supernatural. It is mechanical, medical, and human. An improbable aerodynamic deceleration, immediate attention by medical personnel, and Moran's own physiological resilience combined to produce an outcome that the loss statistics of heavy bomber combat would not have predicted. The immediate aftermath on the ground was a study in contrasts. People who had been under the sightline of bomber defenses had watched the sky erupt and then caught fragments raining down. Villagers and soldiers collected pieces and cataloged them. For the German army, capturing survivors meant interrogation screens, processing as prisoners of war, and the slow bureaucratic machinery of the conflict. For Moran, it meant crude transport to a nearby ambulance station, and in due course to a field hospital. Even there, reports emphasize an initial period of neglect. His wounds so extensive that immediate evacuation was not a priority. But then the attention of surgeons who feared infection more than anything else. One of the striking elements in the records is the international and improvised nature of the care he received. The doctors credited with the emergency procedures were Serbian physicians assigned to the German medical service. Their names are not consistently recorded in the primary files that survive. That absence is not evidence of omission, but of the chaotic record-keeping at the time. What is recorded is the care itself, crude but life-saving operations that included debridement, the cleaning of wound tissue, the setting of fractured bones, and the use of a metal plate to protect damaged cranial tissue. These are medical terms that denote immediate pragmatic choices designed to keep the patient alive long enough to be evacuated to facilities with better resources. There is also the matter of survival statistics for Moran's crew. Of the roughly 10 men on the bomber that day, only 2 would live to see liberation, according to records: Moran and navigator Jesse Orison. The rest were killed in action that November day when the bomber disintegrated in midair. The losses were cataloged in after-action reports filed by the 96th Bomb Group and by casualty offices in the 8th Air Force. These documents provide a cold ledger of names and dates that sits behind any human narrative of valiance and survival. They remind us that Moran's escape from death was not a spectacle of universal salvation, but an anomaly threaded through a tapestry of loss. As Moran lay in the makeshift hospital tent, feverish and bandaged, his story intersected with the broader run of the war. The Nazi war machine was still powerful. Air war tactics were still deadly. Yet by December and into 1944 and 1945, the tide would shift, and the experience of prisoners would include transfer across continents and the nightmare of hell ships transporting POWs under worse than sane conditions. For Moran, those chapters were ahead. So too were the black marches across winter landscapes as the Reich collapsed, and its last prisoners were shuttled by foot and rail under armed guard. But those are chapters to come. For now, this section ends where the first machines of rescue began, with hands that could be called competent, but pressed to the limit, bending and fashioning tools from what little was on hand. With a young man who had tumbled out of the sky and, against expectation, survived the immediate catastrophe. With the quiet and terrible ledger of a crew almost entirely lost. In the bloody arithmetic of aerial warfare, Moran's life hung, precariously, between the engineered failure of a bomber's tail and the raw determination of clinicians working in the bleak edges of war. He had survived a fall from 24,000 feet. He had not yet survived what captivity would do to him. The next stages would test the same stubbornness that had kept his body from surrendering in the cold field. Infection, the slow clearing of fever, the calculation of the enemy, the transit to POW camps, and the endurance required to live through what came next. But that is a story that follows. One step after the cart that carried him from the wreckage toward the uncertain shelter of a field medical facility. Moran's passage from field surgery to the slow machinery of imprisonment was not a straight line but a series of transfers that read like wartime logistics. One tentative step toward survival, another into the waiting engines of bureaucracy. After the makeshift surgery that reportedly saved his life, records indicate he was moved from the temporary frontline facility to a larger military hospital deeper in German territory. There, under the supervision of surgeons working with limited supplies, his wounds were tended again, dressings were changed, infections battled, and the fragile task of restoring function began. His recovery was halting. Days when fever receded were followed by nights of delirium, and it is in these liminal moments that the long arc of his captivity took shape. He was no longer an airman in the air war. He was now a prisoner whose body required constant care. According to military records and surviving correspondence, Moran was eventually processed as a prisoner of war and transferred to the custody of the Wehrmacht. The paperwork that followed was clinical. Name, rank, serial number, injuries noted. He was assigned to a POW camp reported in post-war sources as Stalag Luft 4, the Luftwaffe camp that held American airmen in Pomerania. Stalag Luft I-4, located near the town of Gross Teichau, reported in records as Gross Teichau, place names are presented as reported in contemporary files, became the environment in which Moran would live out the middle years of the war. The camp itself is the subject of many testimonies, a place with wooden barracks, crowded conditions, thin rations, and a guarded routine designed to break the body's rhythms and the spirit that kept men sliding toward despair. Life in Stalag Luft 4, as documented in the recollections of many prisoners, was measured in small economies. The trade of Red Cross parcels when they arrived, the careful division of soup, the barter of cigarettes for small favors. For a man recovering from catastrophic injuries, the daily reality was not only hunger and frost, but the slow rehabilitation of bones and nerves. Records suggest that Moran's recovery in camp included repeated dressings, the removal of necrotic tissue, and the continual battle against infection, an enemy as relentless as the guards. Medical care within the camp was provided by prisoners who had medical training and by the occasional German medical officer. Supplies were limited, and improvisation was constant. Across accounts from Stalag Luft 4, prisoners taught one another, made splints from scavenged wood, and shared knowledge that stood between survival and death. The psychological climate of the camp has been described as fragile, and yet marked by extraordinary pockets of humanity. Men organized classes, theatrical performances, and clandestine lectures to preserve a sense of self and purpose. They read what little they could, shared songs, and held on to rumors like talismans. Rumors of advancing Allied armies, rumors of escape routes, rumors of liberation. Moran's own participation in these cultural acts is reported only in broad strokes in surviving documents. That he listened to talks, that he tried to regain strength where possible, that he kept faith with small routines that made life tolerable. Such details are consistent with the general behavior of POWs in camps like Stalag Luft 4, where morale and mutual support were as crucial to survival as any medical intervention. The war's logistical tides would uproot Moran again. In late 1944 and early 1945, as the Soviet advance pressed on the Eastern Front, German authorities began moving POWs westward. Prisoners were loaded onto trains, often in freight cars with little ventilation and scarcely any food, transfers whose conditions later earned the name Hell Trains for their inhumanity. According to documented accounts from men who endured such voyages, the rides were long, cold, and dirty. The sick were left to sit in their filth, and death on board was not uncommon. Moran, whose condition remained precarious, would have been among those for whom each hour posed a medical hazard. From rail to ship, the term hell ship is used in testimonies to denote the cramped and brutal sea voyages that transported POWs under deplorable conditions. Records indicate that Moran was among prisoners placed aboard such vessels en route to other camps or ports of transfer. The sea movement exposed prisoners to new forms of danger, disease, exposure, and the ever-present threat of enemy action. The term itself is a collective memory of horror rather than a formal designation, and the conditions on board varied by voyage and cargo. But survivors' testimonies converge on the same image: holds packed with men, little light, poor sanitation, and a sense of abandonment. Those who have written about Moran's experience emphasize the compounding effect of repeated trauma, the physical damage from the crash, the initial surgeries under austere conditions, the malnutrition of camp life, and the physical depletion of transfers and ship voyages. Each element weakened the body's natural defenses and made infection and exhaustion constant threats. Yet again and again it was reported that small acts, an improvised splint, a clean dressing, a fellow prisoner sharing a scrap of bread, kept men living long enough to see the next day. By early 1945, the Nazi administrative order had begun to fracture. As Allied forces pushed from the west and the Soviet army from the east, German commanders evacuated camps ahead of the fronts, forcing prisoners to march in columns into an increasingly chaotic landscape. The forced marches that followed are often described by survivors as death marches for their brutality and high cost in lives. One such march, documented in contemporary records and in survivor testimony from Stalag Luft 4, stretched for weeks in sub-zero temperatures, through snow and slush, with meager clothing and insufficient footwear. Men walked by night and rested by day, or were driven by rifle butt and bayonet point when they lagged. Food was scarce. Shelters were barns and ruined buildings where men huddled together to conserve warmth. This is the context in which what became known as the Black March unfolded. Testimonies and after-action reports recount columns of prisoners moving westward under guard, the land around them scarred by retreat and combat. Many who endured the walks collapsed from exhaustion, hypothermia, or disease. Some were left at the roadside. For the injured, each step reopened wounds. For those with past head trauma, the cold and exertion could provoke delirium. Moran's own movements during the march are documented as a series of transfers and guarded columns. He did not travel alone, but among hundreds of men whose fates were uncertain. The solidarity among prisoners, sharing rations, carrying one another when possible, saved lives in ways large and small. Reports from survivors of the Black March include images of barns crowded with sleeping men, the stench of overcrowding, and the grim arithmetic of loss. Yet amid these images there were also acts of care, prisoners trading their last food, fashioning warm clothing, and sharing what knowledge they had about wounds and treatment. For Moran, whose head and limbs had already been through repeated surgical attention, these acts were literal lifelines. Records indicate that his condition improved only gradually. He lost weight, strength, and months of normal function. But the fact of his continued respiration became, in itself, a testament to the network of care that existed even within captivity. April 1945 is the turning point in many POW accounts. As Allied armored columns pushed into German territory, prisoners awaited either liberation or the next catastrophic transfer. For Moran and his fellow airmen, liberation arrived with the slow, advancing steps of the Allied armies. Documents linking the liberation of particular camps to specific units vary, and where the historical record is unambiguous, the credit for final rescue often goes to infantry divisions and armored units that happened upon camps in the course of their advance. Some accounts attribute liberation to the 104th Infantry Division in the general theater surrounding Pomerania and northern Germany. When unit assignments differ across sources, historians note variations and classify them as reported outcomes. What matters in the lived experience is the minute in which armed guards ceased to stand between the prisoners and the outside world, and the noise of the front became the sound of help rather than threat. The immediate post-liberation scene is one of chaotic mercy. Aid organizations and army medics set up triage, makeshift hospitals received the walked-in and the carried-in. For men like Moran, liberation was the first door to more advanced medical care in months or years. He was, according to repatriation records, evaluated and eventually placed on transport toward formal Allied medical facilities. The process of medical evacuation, marked by travel on ambulance trains, flights when possible, and careful documentation, would bring him back into Allied hands and into the care of physicians with broader supplies and access to better prosthetics and sterilization methods. Recovery, however, was not a rapid return to normalcy. The wounds Moran had accumulated were not merely physical scars that could be stitched closed. They were injuries that required long convalescence and rehabilitation. Hospitals in the United States, veteran medical centers and military hospitals devoted to returning servicemen, became places where he could undergo reconstructive procedures, continue physical therapy, and receive psychiatric evaluation when appropriate. His reintegration into American life was also marked by bureaucratic processes, discharge papers, disability assessments, and the vagaries of veterans' benefits. According to veterans' records, many airmen returning from Europe faced years of medical appointments and the slow rebuilding of daily capacity. When Moran returned to Wisconsin, he returned to a life reshaped by absence. He married Margaret Finley, reported in post-war records as Margaret Finley, started a family, and settled into a quiet life that resisted the headline drama of his wartime experience. Community records and family testimonies suggest he worked the land, raised children, and performed the steady tasks required of farm life. The outward rhythms of family and farm life masked, for many years, a profound interior silence. Moran rarely spoke at length about his wartime years. Where he did, it was often sparingly, framed by the practical details he could bear to recount, rather than by the private terrors that seemed to sit like an invisible weight. This silence was, for many veterans of intense combat, a hallmark of survival. The reluctance or inability to retell again and again the scenes that had nearly destroyed them. Recognition came slowly and unevenly. Fellow airmen, historians, and local communities undertook long efforts to piece together the stories of crews lost and the anomalies of those who survived. Records of Moran's awards are part of public archives. He received recognition consistent with being wounded and for his service in the 8th Air Force, including service medals and wound-related decorations reported in official files. Local honors, citations, plaques, and veterans events followed in later decades as communities sought to acknowledge the extraordinary odds some of their sons had faced. Scholarly and popular works about bomber operations, POW experiences, and individual survival stories began to reference Moran's fall as an example of a near-impossible escape from death. Researchers consulted debriefs and interviewed surviving witnesses. Some published narratives and articles used Moran's story to illuminate larger truths about air war and human resilience. One recurring theme in the post-war recounting of Moran's life is the blend of chance and agency. Engineers and historians have attempted to explain how a severed tail section could slow its descent enough to make survival possible. The answers, while technical and probabilistic, do not erase the human element. The fact that he remained in the tail, that he was shielded in part by the remaining fuselage, that the landing occurred in a manner and place where immediate capture rather than abandonment to the elements followed. Medical testimony credits the early surgical interventions, both on the field and later, with preventing fatal infection and stabilizing cranial damage. Together, these factors created a narrow corridor between death and life. When the decades passed, Moran's story found new audiences. Historians and journalists pieced together accounts from squadron logs, hospital notes, and witness testimony. Some works, books and documentaries about bomber crews and POW experiences, mentioned his fall as an extraordinary case. One historian involved in researching the crew's history appears in later interviews. His name is reported in various transcriptions with uncertain spelling, historian referred to in some sources as John Armster or similar variants. Please note reported variants and verify spelling in primary records. Such discrepancies are typical in the reconstruction of individual stories from fragmentary wartime records. What remains constant in the archival record and in corroborating testimony is the central fact that Moran fell in a severed tail section from roughly 24,000 feet and survived to live a long, if troubled, life. The moral weight of this story rests partly in that contrast, how a single survival can sit alongside the names of friends who did not return. Moran's crew losses, recorded in official casualty lists, are not footnotes, but central facts that the narrative does not soften. Remembering Moran's endurance must mean also remembering those who died in the same instant when the B-17 came apart. It is this duality, survival and loss, individual miracle and communal price, that shapes how communities remember the air war. Moran's later years were also marked by the complicated emotional geography of returning veterans. He married and fathered children. He engaged in community life. He accepted local honors that acknowledged his wartime service. Yet members of his family and those who knew him described in sources available to researchers the long shadow such an experience casts. He rarely sought the limelight. He attended occasional commemorative events. He allowed interviews only with reserve and measured detail. For many veterans, such reticence is not aloofness, but a protective mechanism against re-engaging pain. In the final public acts of his life, Moran received formal recognition from veteran organizations and local authorities who sought to honor survivors of extreme ordeals. These events were, according to press accounts and program notes, subdued affairs, the presentation of a plaque, an award with a brief citation, a handshake, and the customary photograph. For a man who had once fallen from 24,000 feet in a broken machine and survived, these small tokens were as much about communal memory as about individual acclaim. Families kept scrapbooks. Community museums folded his story into local histories. Historians placed his survival within broader narratives about the bomber offensive, the perils of daylight raids, and the human consequences of the air war. Reflecting on what it meant to survive a B-17 crash in the fuller sense, the phrase the title promises, requires peeling back several layers. There is the physical fact of survival, exiting a catastrophe alive. There is the medical fact of healing, surgeries, sutures, months of convalescence. There is the social fact of return, marriage, family, reintegration. And there is the psychological fact, the ways memory and silence reconfigure a life. For Moran, surviving that fall was not a single instantaneous miracle, but a chain of events, structural chance in the air, surgical skill on the ground, tolerance of disease, solidarity among prisoners, and ultimately, liberation by advancing armies. Each link in that chain mattered. To dwell on the mechanics is not to diminish the human element. The tail section that carried him to the ground was, in effect, a piece of machinery co-opted into service as a crude life preserver. The surgeons who stitched and plated and debrided were men working under moral and professional obligation, whether German or Serbian or Allied, performing acts that crossed the conflict's lines. The fellow prisoners who shared food or tended to a wound were a network of care improvised under duress. These are the human instances that, when summed together, made survival possible. Moran's story also stands as a reminder of the cost of strategic decisions. The daylight bombing campaign that placed him over Bremen was part of a larger strategy whose moral and tactical calculus remains debated. The narrative here does not offer a verdict, but insists on complexity. Strategic purposes collide with human lives. A formation's mission intersects with individual choices and bodily vulnerabilities. At the center of these collisions were young men like Moran, farm boys, students, and workers, trapped in the engines of global conflict. In the years after his death, scholars and family members have continued to preserve and interpret Moran's experience. Oral histories, official archives, and local memorials keep the memory alive. For those who study air war, his fall becomes a case study. In aerodynamics, in survival probability, in the role of field medicine. For community members, it becomes a piece of local lore, an almost cinematic tale that, stripped of legend, still carries the gravity of historical fact. The final beat of this story returns to the title's central promise: surviving a B-17 crash. The heroic tale of a gunner's plunge from 24,000 feet. That plunge was an event of monumental randomness and technical peculiarities. The surviving man's life after it was a slow negotiation with the consequences. He lived decades after the crash. He married, raised a family, and kept the war largely to himself, a private archive of images and scars. He accepted honors, but he never allowed his survival to become a spectacle. Instead, in community rooms and family albums, in veterans' reunions and archival files, his story took its place among the many threads that make up the collective memory of the war. If there is a lesson in Moran's survival, it is a modest and somber one. Extraordinary resilience often depends on ordinary acts. Skillful surgery performed with inadequate tools, the willingness of comrades to share scant food and heat, the bureaucratic insistence on logging a name into a ledger that would one day make freedom possible. Chance aligns with care. Technology fails and sometimes saves, and a single life, saved against the odds, carries forward the weight of many others who were not so fortunate. For those who wish to learn more, the archival record is the starting place. Squadron logs of the 96th Bomb Group, 8th Air Force debriefs, and POW camp records. Works that explore the bomber offensive and POW experiences, documentary collections and scholarly monographs, provide the broader context in which Moran's story sits. A number of books and articles chronicle similar survivals and the medical improvisations of wartime surgeons. One recommended approach for further reading is to consult both unit histories and memoir collections to triangulate the many small facts that compose any single life's wartime narrative. If you have family members who served or stories passed down in your community, sharing those memories helps keep the historical record alive. Share this video or leave a comment if you have a connection to a crew or veteran. These histories persist when people remember and pass them on.